What if half the world went vegan? So no meat, no eggs, no cheese, and half your friends have the incessant urge to tell you about their morals and all the restaurants they can't go to. Well, depending on how you rationalize your diet or pick your friends for that matter, that could sound pretty terrible. But don't worry, this video isn't about the ethics, but primarily about the data that you need to be aware of. Only the most valuable information was packed into this video. But the big takeaway you'll get is an objective evaluation of what would happen to our planet and societies if half the world went vegan. Starting off, what would happen to Earth? If half the world went vegan, it would trigger planet-wide changes in the quality of Earth's land, water, and air. For context, as the world has gotten richer, we've consumed more meat over time, to the extent that we actually consume 3 times as much as we did 50 years ago. And it turns out that artificially increasing a species' population size requires more resources to support them. Of course, some of this increase came along with human population growth. But animal agriculture is big, enormous even, considering all the industries involved are responsible for 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, nearly equal to the emissions from every plane, car, train, and boat on Earth combined. Although a recent report indicates that if everyone went vegan, our food-related emissions could be cut 70% by 2050. For this video, we'll just take half, since half the population transitioning to veganism seems slightly more realistic. And if that sounds crazy to you, it'll make a lot more sense by the end. A 35% reduction would give many countries more time to adapt to the effects of climate change, since reducing methane, cow burps, is a quick way to reduce global heating since methane degrades faster than carbon. This doesn't tell the whole story though, since emissions don't directly factor into land and water use. Currently, we dedicate 77% of global agricultural land for livestock, but most of that land is primarily used for grazing and growing feed for the animals that we end up eating anyway. Studies show that skipping the middleman, in other words, non-human animals, turns out to be more efficient when comparing meat against plant-based products in land use. As an example, it can take over 100 times more land to produce a gram of protein from beef or lamb versus peas or tofu. So let's say half of humanity became vegan. This means we could reclaim roughly 38.5% of global agricultural land that farmers could convert into human-centric produce, renewable energy farms, or even get paid subsidies to reforest their land. The chosen strategy would depend on the land itself, but ultimately, animal agriculture is the leading cause of deforestation. And a 2019 analysis claims that planting 1 billion hectares of forest could help remove 2/3 of CO2 emissions. This potential elimination of emissions wouldn't solve climate change, but it would help stabilize the Earth's average temperature and give us more time to figure out how to power our lives with clean energy. When looking at animal agriculture's water consumption, about 30% of the 1% fresh water on Earth is used to water crops, hydrate the animals, and irrigate mountains worth of, farms have to flush too. Unlike human sewage, animal farms aren't subject to the same sanitation standards as we're used to. So a lot of that sewage actually drains into the ocean and creates something called a dead zone, meaning leaking pesticides and feces with a dash of global heating is creating marine environments that have no oxygen, and no oxygen means no fish. We also need to keep in mind that the majority of crops are grown for other animals. So simply by volume, animal products are most closely linked to pesticide runoff and harm to pollinating species like bumblebees. Thankfully, dead zones can recover pretty quick, but only if we stop feeding them pollutants from the land. So let's say half the world went vegan. This could provide humanity with an additional 25% more fresh water, and we would likely see a sharp decrease in the amount of animal sewage flowing into our oceans. Considering dead zones have quadrupled in size over the last 50 years, and more droughts are expected as the climate warms, a large shift to veganism could help revitalize our oceans and preserve more fresh water for direct human consumption. If this shift does occur, what effects would a diet like this have on society as a whole though? I think the common hypothetical of everyone on Earth going vegan at the same time is an overestimate of people's tolerance for change. But with the advent of lab-grown meat, plant-based meats, and vertical farming, a transition to veganism could seem a lot more feasible. Disregarding ethics, plants are objectively more efficient and provide better health outcomes for people since processed meat is categorized as a Group 1 carcinogen, which is the same status given to a cigarette. Plus, foods high in LDL cholesterol cause heart disease and diabetes at increased rates. Assuming meat alternatives reach an economy of scale, those products could become cheaper and chip away at the market share from animal products. So think of the recent trend of consumers choosing plant milks over dairy milk, or the fact that all these fast food chains have added a vegan meat option in the last year. If half the world went vegan over the span of a couple decades, this would necessitate governments across the world to change how they allocate money toward their agriculture systems. Since the majority of global agriculture subsidies are directed toward feeding livestock or livestock themselves. With more people eating plants, taxpayer-funded subsidies would likely be amended to incentivize farmers to plant more for human consumption or reforest their land to mitigate climate change. But interestingly, this transition may save society a lot of money in many indirect ways. Using the $4 McDonald's Big Mac as an example, it's cheap and delicious. But here are estimates of the extra costs that product places on society. So assuming half the world went vegan, we may see a general improvement in human health. And less money would be spent on hospital bills and environmental damage.
They want to rebuild your home. They want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamt about, but never achieved.
I know the idea of your food choices affecting other people or the planet sounds pretty weird, right? But some evidence indicates we could save around 4 million human lives by 2050 and help prevent nearly $1 trillion in climate change related damages over time, merely by switching the way we eat and optimizing the way we use our soil. Get this though, there's estimated to be around 79 million vegans, which is roughly 1% of the global population. But meat consumption is growing too, since many developing countries have gotten richer. And that means that a lot of the expensive foods reserved for the wealthy have become more accessible. Currently, there's no indication that meat consumption will slow down. But before you decide if your personal choice or convenience is worth it, here is everything you need to know. If half the world went vegan, roughly 35% of food-related emissions would drop off. And we could reclaim 38.5% of all agricultural land on Earth to grow human-centric crops, generate renewable energy, or plant forests. Humanity would also save an additional 15% of the world's freshwater to personally drink and store for drier climate change-driven drought years. Runoff pollution is hard to track, but with a reduction in farmed animals, we would likely see a significant drop in animal feces and pesticides draining into our ocean, helping dead zones become alive zones. Then agricultural subsidies would be transferred to make produce cheaper and incentivize companies to create totally new flavors with plants or culture cells to create lab-grown meat. Not to mention that half the population may see a 9% reduction in all causes of death compared to our omnivore peers. This topic tends to get people pretty riled up, but if you made it to the end, I'd love to know what you think. Can you claim to be an environmentalist and still eat meat? That aside, today was all about sustainability, but the next video could be about a world-changing technology that affects your life. So if you're into that kind of thing, subscribe for more, but I will see you in the next one.